She said it like she was reading off a label someone else had stuck on her years ago and had just stopped arguing with. Nobody wants a single mom of three. I said, then I'll be the first. I meant it as a joke, half a joke, the kind of thing you say to break tension in a parking lot at 11 at night. I didn't know yet that within 4 months, I'd be standing in a courtroom hallway finding out exactly how much that sentence was going to cost me, and that I'd still, without hesitation, say it again. I met Rachel on a Thursday night in the parking lot of a grocery store, at the exact moment her car wouldn't start, and her youngest was screaming in the back seat about something entirely unrelated to the car. I wasn't trying to be a hero. I was just walking to my own car, arms full of bags, when I heard a woman muttering something under her breath at a dashboard that clearly wasn't cooperating, and a kid in a booster seat behind her, losing his mind over what I'd later learn was a broken crayon. An actual, specific, 3-year-old-sized tragedy that had apparently ruined his entire evening. "You okay?" I asked, setting my bags down. "Define okay," she said, not looking up from the dashboard. "My car won't start, my son is grieving a crayon, and my other two are somewhere inside this grocery store, because I sent them to grab the one thing I forgot, and I genuinely don't know which crisis to deal with first." I laughed before I could stop myself, and she looked up, seemed to register for the first time that a stranger was standing there, and gave a tired, apologetic half-smile. "Sorry, long week. Long month, honestly." I offered to take a look at the car. Turned out to be nothing serious. A loose battery terminal. The kind of thing that takes 2 minutes to fix once you know what you're looking for. While I worked on it, her other two kids came out of the store, a girl around 9 carrying a gallon of milk like it was the most important cargo in the world, and a boy around 6 trailing behind her, both of them stopping short at the sight of a stranger crouched over their car's engine. I want to pause here and tell you a little about where I was in my own life that night, because it matters for understanding why I stopped to help at all, instead of just walking past like most people probably would have. I was 31. Recently out of a 2-year relationship that had ended not because of some dramatic betrayal, but because, if I'm honest, I'd never fully committed to it. I'd kept one foot out the door the entire time, some vague fear of being tied down to anything too permanent, too real. My ex had told me, on her way out, that I was waiting for a life to happen to me instead of building one, which stung mostly because I suspected she was right. So when I saw a woman visibly overwhelmed in a parking lot, juggling more than any one person should reasonably have to juggle alone, something in me, maybe guilt, maybe just basic decency, maybe some early instinct I didn't fully understand yet, made me stop instead of walking past. "Mom, who's that?" the girl asked, with the specific suspicion only a 9-year-old can level at an unfamiliar adult. "Someone very kind who's fixing our car," Rachel said. "Say thank you." "Thank you," the girl said, still suspicious, and climbed into the back seat without further comment. I got the car started. Rachel thanked me about 4 times, clearly embarrassed by how much help she'd needed for something so small, and before she drove off, she said, half joking, "If you ever need someone to fix your entire life in a parking lot, I apparently owe you one." I laughed again, told her it was nothing, and watched her drive off. 3 kids, 1 grieving crayon, 1 gallon of milk, and a woman who looked like she'd been running on fumes for longer than just that 1 week. I didn't expect to see her again. I definitely didn't expect, 2 weeks later, to run into her at the same grocery store, both of us reaching for the same last carton of eggs, and for her to laugh and say, "Oh, the parking lot guy. Small world." We started talking regularly after that second run-in, nothing formal, just a coffee here, a conversation there, the kind of slow-building thing that doesn't announce itself as dating until you're already several weeks into it. Rachel was 34, worked as a medical billing coordinator, and had 3 kids, Emma, 9, Noah, 6, and Caleb, 3, all from a marriage that had ended 2 years earlier when her ex-husband Derek decided fatherhood and marriage were both bigger commitments than he'd actually wanted. He hadn't cheated, hadn't done anything dramatic. He'd just, over the course of about a year, stopped trying, stopped showing up emotionally, and eventually told Rachel he needed space to figure out who he was, which turned out to mean an apartment across town and a rotating cast of much younger girlfriends he introduced to the kids, far too casually, far too soon, and far too inconsistently. Rachel told me all of this without much self-pity, in the same matter-of-fact tone I later learned was just how she talked about hard things. Not because she didn't feel them, but because feeling sorry for herself out loud wasn't a luxury she'd had much time for since becoming a single parent of 3. I've dated a little, she told me, about a month into whatever this had quietly become. Not much. Most guys hear 3 kids and you can watch the math happen behind their eyes in real time. They're not bad guys necessarily. They're just doing the calculation, is this worth it? And the answer is usually no, and I don't even blame them for it anymore. It's a lot. I know it's a lot. Has anyone actually said that to you, out loud? I asked. She was quiet for a second. One guy did, about a year ago. Told me, pretty much verbatim, that nobody really wants a single mom of 3, that it's just too much responsibility for most men to sign up for voluntarily, and that I should probably adjust my expectations. I didn't cry about it or anything dramatic. I just filed it away as, I don't know, useful information. A fact about my situation I needed to plan around. I didn't say anything clever in response right away. I just sat with how casually she'd delivered that sentence, like it had long since stopped being an insult and had just become a data point she used to manage her own expectations. Can I ask what you actually want? I said, once I'd found something to say, as opposed to what you've adjusted your expectations down to. She looked at me for a long moment, like nobody had asked her that particular question in a while, phrased quite that way. I want someone who doesn't treat the kids like an obstacle course they're navigating to get to me, she said finally. I want someone who shows up on the hard days, not just the easy ones. I want someone who doesn't need constant reassurance that this is worth it, because honestly, I don't have the energy to keep reassuring anyone. I have 3 kids who need that from me already. I don't have it left over for a grown man too. That's a fair thing to want, I said. It's apparently a lot to ask, she said, not bitterly, just tired. But thank you for not immediately telling me it's not. It would be another 2 months before I said the thing that ended up being the title of this whole story. But that conversation is where the sentence actually planted itself in me, long before I said it back to her. I met Emma, Noah, and Caleb properly about 6 weeks into dating Rachel at a low-key Saturday afternoon where she invited me over for what she called the full chaos experience, no filter, see if you survive it. I did not, initially, survive it gracefully. Caleb 3 decided within the first 10 minutes that I was a jungle gym and climbed onto my back mid-conversation without warning. Noah 6 quizzed me relentlessly about my opinion on dinosaurs, apparently as some kind of unofficial screening process. Emma 9 watched all of it from a careful distance, arms crossed, saying almost nothing. Clearly the most guarded of the 3, clearly the one who remembered the most about how things had gone with Derek, and wasn't in a hurry to invest emotional trust in another man who might not stick around. I understood that instinctively. I didn't push her. I answered Noah's dinosaur questions, let Caleb use me as furniture, and mostly just let Emma watch from her careful distance without trying to force anything. At the end of that afternoon, once the boys had worn themselves out and gone down for a nap, Emma finally approached me on her own. No prompting from Rachel. Are you going to be like Dad? She asked. Direct, no preamble. The way kids ask the questions adults spend years working up the courage to ask each other. I don't know your dad, I said carefully. I can't promise I'll never make mistakes, but I can tell you I'm not planning on disappearing. That's the only real answer I have right now, because anything more would just be a promise I haven't earned the right to make yet. She studied me for a long moment, the way her mother did when she was deciding whether to trust something. That's a weird answer, she finally said. Probably, I agreed. But it's the honest one. She didn't say anything else, just nodded once, like she was filing the answer away for later evaluation, and went to go find her brothers. Rachel, who'd been listening from the kitchen the whole time, caught my eye and gave me a small, grateful smile that told me I'd passed some kind of test I hadn't fully known I was taking. Over the following weeks, I started coming around more regularly, not every day, but enough that I stopped being Mom's friend in Noah's dinosaur-adjacent vocabulary and started being referred to, without much ceremony, just by my first name, said the same way you'd refer to any other fixture in a household. Caleb continued treating me as furniture, which I decided to interpret as a compliment. Noah's dinosaur interrogations evolved into an ongoing project where we built an elaborate, mostly inaccurate timeline of prehistoric creatures out of a coloring book and too much tape. Emma remained the hardest to reach, and I didn't push it. I'd learned, mostly from watching Rachel, that pushing a kid like Emma toward trust faster than she was ready to give it usually backfired. So I just kept showing up, consistently, without asking anything of her in return, and let her decide on her own timeline whether that consistency meant anything. It was around the 2-month mark that she started, gradually, letting her guard down in small, specific ways. asking me to help with a school project, mentioning offhand that she liked a particular show, once even laughing, genuinely, at something I said, and then looking almost surprised at herself for having done it, like she'd let something slip she hadn't meant to. The actual sentence, the one that became the reason I'm telling you any of this, happened about 3 months into dating Rachel, on a night that started badly and ended up being one of the most important nights of my life. Caleb had a fever that wouldn't break. Rachel had spent the entire evening bouncing between him and Noah's homework and Emma's sudden, unexplained tears over something at school she wouldn't talk about. And by the time I showed up to help, she'd texted me in a mild panic around 7. The whole apartment felt like it was running on the last few percent of everyone's battery. I remember walking in and finding Rachel sitting on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets. Caleb draped over her shoulder, half asleep and flushed with fever. A thermometer and a half-empty bottle of children's medicine on the floor beside her, looking up at me with an expression I hadn't seen from her before. Not her usual capable, managing it exhaustion, but something closer to actually being at the end of what she had left to give. "I don't usually let it get like this," she said, almost apologetically, like she needed to explain the mess before I judged it. "You don't have to explain anything to me," I said, already crouching down to take Caleb from her arms so she could stand up and breathe for a second. "Go check on Noah's homework. I've got him." We got Caleb's fever down eventually, got Noah's homework finished, got Emma calm enough to at least stop crying even if she still wouldn't explain why. By the time all 3 kids were finally asleep, it was almost 11, and Rachel and I ended up sitting in my car in the parking lot outside her building, both of us too wired and too exhausted to actually say goodnight yet. "I need to ask you something," she said, staring straight ahead through the windshield instead of at me, "and I need you to actually think about it before you answer. Not just say the nice thing." "Okay." "This," she said, gesturing vaguely at the building. "At the entire evening we just survived. This is what it actually is. Not the fun parts. Not the coffee dates. This. Fevers and homework meltdowns, and a 9-year-old who cries about something she won't explain, and 2 boys who need constant supervision, and a schedule that never actually stops. Ever. Not on weekends, not on holidays, not when you're tired, not when you'd rather be doing literally anything else. This is the real version of what dating me means, and I need you to really sit with that before this goes any further. Because I've had it explained to me before, pretty bluntly, that nobody actually wants this. Nobody wants a single mom of 3, and I've made my peace with that. I just don't want you deciding 6 months from now that the guy who said that to me was right." I looked at her for a long moment. She still wasn't looking at me, bracing for an answer she'd clearly rehearsed hearing before, in one form or another. "Then I'll be the first," I said. She turned to look at me then, and I could see her trying to figure out if I was joking, or saying something I hadn't actually thought through. The kind of thing people say in a charged moment and quietly walk back later once reality sets in. "I'm not saying that to be romantic," I said. "I'm saying it because I've spent the last 3 months watching you run yourself into the ground for 3 kids who are lucky to have you. And somewhere in there, without really deciding to, I stopped thinking of tonight as something I was tolerating to get to the good parts. Tonight was just tonight. It wasn't a cost, it was just what being with you actually looks like, and I'd rather have this than a version of my life with fewer complications and less of you in it." She didn't say anything for a while. When she finally did, her voice was quieter than I'd heard it before. "Okay," she said. "I believe you. For now. Ask me again in 6 months." I didn't know yet how literally she meant that. I want to tell you the part of this story that actually tested whether that sentence in the parking lot meant anything, because it would have been easy to say it in a quiet car at 11 at night. It was harder to mean it 4 months later, when Derek decided, out of nowhere, that he wanted primary custody. It happened fast, and it happened ugly. Derek had, apparently, gotten engaged to one of the girlfriends Rachel had mentioned, a woman named Britt who was, according to Rachel, decent enough on her own but had somehow convinced Derek that a stable-looking household, him, Britt, a bigger apartment, a dog, would look better in front of a judge than Rachel's actual, exhausting, real day-to-day competence as the parent who'd shown up for every single school event, every fever, every meltdown, for 2 straight years without meaningful help. He filed for a custody modification. Rachel found out via a certified letter, standing in her kitchen, and I watched her go pale reading it. Watched 2 years of exhausted, uncomplaining competence suddenly feel like it might not be enough in the face of a man with a new fiancé and a lawyer he could apparently afford now that he wasn't paying full child support. He hasn't shown up for a single school event in 8 months, she said, staring at the letter like it might rearrange itself into something less frightening if she looked hard enough. He missed Noah's entire soccer season. He's seen Caleb maybe 6 times all year. And now he wants primary custody because he's got a fiancé with a house with a yard, and apparently that's supposed to matter more than actually being there. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest I'd seen Rachel go through, harder even than that first exhausted night in the parking lot. She had to take unpaid time off work for mediation sessions, which put real financial strain on a household that didn't have much slack to begin with. Emma started having nightmares she wouldn't fully describe, waking up some nights convinced her brothers were going to be taken away to live somewhere unfamiliar. Noah, usually easygoing, started acting out at school in small ways. Nothing serious, but out of character enough that his teacher called home twice in the same month. Caleb, too young to understand any of it directly, just seemed to absorb the tension in the house and became clingier, harder to settle at bedtime, waking up more than he had in months. I won't pretend I knew exactly what to do. I'm not a lawyer. I didn't have some clever solution that fixed it instantly. What I did have was time, and I used it. I went to every meeting with the family lawyer Rachel eventually hired, sat in the waiting room during 2 separate mediation sessions, kept the kids fed and distracted, and as normal as possible, on the days Rachel had to disappear into appointments she couldn't bring them to. I also, quietly, without telling Rachel until much later, started picking up extra shifts at my own job to help cover the unpaid time off she was taking. It wasn't a grand gesture. I didn't want it to be treated as one. It just felt like the practical extension of what "then I'll be the first" actually meant when the situation stopped being hypothetical and became a stack of unpaid bills on a kitchen counter. My own mother, when I told her what was happening, asked me a question I wasn't fully prepared for. "Are you sure you want to be this involved in someone else's custody battle? This isn't your fight. If it goes badly, you're not even legally connected to any of this. You could just step back. Nobody would blame you." "I know nobody would blame me," I said. "That's not really the question, though." "Then what is the question?" "The question is whether I meant it when I said I'd be the first person who didn't treat this like too much. If I step back the first time it gets genuinely hard, then I didn't mean it. I just said something that sounded good in a parking lot." My mother didn't push further after that. I think she understood, even if she didn't say so directly, that I'd already made the decision and just needed to say it out loud to someone to confirm it to myself. My sister was less subtle about her doubts. She called me about 3 weeks into the custody proceedings, ostensibly to check in, but I could tell within a few minutes that she'd actually called to talk me out of something. "I'm just saying," she said, "you've been dating this woman for less than a year, and you're already sitting in on custody hearings for kids that aren't yours, missing work, apparently helping pay bills for a household you're not even living in yet. Has it occurred to you that you might be moving way too fast into something you can't actually walk back from if it doesn't work out?" "That's exactly the point," I said. "I don't want it to be something I could walk back from easily. If it's easy to walk back from, it's not actually a commitment. It's just convenient enough to feel like one until it isn't." "That's a very noble-sounding way of describing financial and emotional exposure to 3 kids who aren't yours," she said. "Maybe," I said. "But I've spent most of my adult life keeping one foot out the door of everything, waiting to see if things would work out before I actually committed to them. I watched that cost me my last relationship. I'm not interested in doing it again just because this version is scarier and has higher stakes. The stakes being higher is kind of the point." She didn't have a response to that right away, and eventually, a few months later, once she'd actually met Rachel and the kids at a family gathering, she told me, unprompted, that she understood now, in a way she hadn't over the phone. Watching me with Emma, Noah, and Caleb in person had apparently done more to convince her than any argument I could have made. The financial strain was real too, and I don't want to gloss over it because I think it matters to the actual shape of this story. Picking up extra shifts, covering costs Rachel couldn't cover during her unpaid leave, contributing toward the legal fees once it became clear the custody fight was going to drag on longer than anyone expected. None of it was dramatic on its own, but stacked together over several months, it meant a version of my own life that looked noticeably different than it had a year earlier. Fewer nights out with friends, a vacation I'd been saving for that quietly got postponed, then postponed again, then eventually just stopped being something I planned around at all. I say it because I think people sometimes imagine commitment as a single dramatic moment, a proposal, a courtroom speech, when really it's mostly made of 100 smaller, unglamorous choices that nobody's watching you make. The custody hearing itself was, honestly, one of the worst days of that entire year. Derek's lawyer painted a picture of an overwhelmed single mother, stretched too thin across 3 kids, working full-time, with, pointedly, a boyfriend of unclear commitment level as her only support system. I sat in that courtroom hallway during a recess, watching Rachel try to hold herself together in a hallway that smelled like old carpet and stress, and I understood, with total clarity, exactly how much that parking lot sentence was actually going to cost me if I meant it. Derek himself barely looked at Rachel the entire day, which somehow felt worse than if he'd been openly hostile. He sat next to Britt, his fiancée, in a suit that looked new, answering questions from his own lawyer about the house they were building together, the stability he could now offer, the fresh start he framed as being in the children's best interest. I remember watching him describe Caleb's age wrong, off by nearly a year, and catching Rachel's hand tighten on the armrest beside me, a small, silent proof of exactly how much he'd actually been paying attention these past 2 years. I asked to speak with Rachel's lawyer during that recess. I told her I wanted to make something clear, on the record if it would help, that I wasn't a temporary, unclear presence in these kids' lives, that I'd been there for 8 months, consistently, through fevers and homework and a custody battle that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with why I wasn't going anywhere. The lawyer said it might actually help to have that on record, given Derek's team was trying to paint instability into the picture. I testified, briefly, during the hearing. Not dramatically. Nothing you'd see in a courtroom drama. I just answered honest questions about how long I'd been present in the kids' lives, what that looked like day to day, whether I intended that to continue. I remember being asked directly by Derek's lawyer whether I had any legal or financial obligation to these children whatsoever, clearly trying to establish that my presence was optional, revocable, meaningless in any way that mattered to a judge. I said no, I didn't have any legal obligation. And then, without being asked, I added that I didn't need one to know I wasn't leaving, and that the difference between an obligation and a choice was, in my experience, usually the better predictor of who actually stuck around. I don't know if that line mattered legally. I know it mattered to me, saying it out loud, in a room where the entire argument being made against Rachel was built on the assumption that men like me eventually leave. I remember Emma's face in the gallery. She'd insisted on being there, old enough now to understand more of what was happening than either of us wanted her to. Watching me answer those questions with the same careful, evaluating expression she'd given me that first Saturday afternoon, still deciding, still filing information away. The judge ultimately kept custody arrangements essentially as they were, with some adjusted visitation for Derek contingent on actual consistency, which, as Rachel's lawyer told us afterward, quietly relieved, was in no small part because the court saw a stable, consistent, two-adult household already functioning, rather than the chaotic single-mother narrative Derek's side had tried to construct. I remember the exact moment the judge read the ruling. Rachel's hand found mine under the table, without either of us really deciding to reach for the other. Just instinct, the way you grab for something solid when the ground has felt unsteady for weeks. I watched her exhale, slow and shaking, like she'd been holding that particular breath since the certified letter first arrived. Derek's expression, across the room, didn't register much of anything at all. Not anger, not disappointment, just a kind of flat acceptance that told me, more than anything else that day, exactly how much of this had actually been about the kids in the first place, and how much of it had been about something else entirely. Outside the courtroom, in the hallway, Rachel's lawyer shook both our hands and said something I've thought about since. For what it's worth, she said, cases like this usually come down to one question underneath all the legal language. Who actually shows up? Judges see through performative stability pretty quickly. What they can't see through is 2 years of consistent, unglamorous, actual presence. That's what won this today. Not the fancier lawyer, not the bigger house, just who was actually there. We left the courthouse that day and went, of all places, to get ice cream, because Rachel said she needed something normal and small after a day that had felt enormous and awful in equal measure. The boys were oblivious to most of what had happened, mostly relieved just to be eating ice cream on a school day. But Emma was quiet in the car, quiet at the ice cream shop, quiet in a way that made me worry the whole ordeal had been too much for a 9-year-old to sit through. Rachel noticed too, and tried a few times to gently ask if she wanted to talk about it, but Emma just shook her head and picked at her ice cream, saying almost nothing until we were back home. It wasn't until we were back at the apartment, the boys occupied with a movie, that she finally sought me out again, the same way she had that first Saturday. "You didn't have to do that today," she said. "The talking to the judge thing." "I know," I said. Dad's lawyer said you weren't really part of the family, like, officially. I felt something tighten in my chest, bracing for whatever was coming next. That's true. Legally, I'm not. But you stood up and talked anyway, she said. Like you were. Because I am, I said. Just not on paper yet. She was quiet for a long moment, processing that the way she processed most things. Carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. Remember when I asked if you were going to be like Dad? She finally said. You said you couldn't promise you'd never mess up, but you weren't planning on disappearing. I didn't really believe you back then. I've been kind of waiting for you to disappear this whole time, actually. Like, quietly expecting it, even when things were going okay. I used to check, kind of. Little things. Whether you'd remember stuff about us, or whether you were just being nice because you were dating Mom. I never told anyone I was doing that. It felt embarrassing to admit I was basically testing you the whole time without saying so. That's not embarrassing, I said. That's smart. You'd already learned that people don't always mean what they say. I'd probably have done the same thing in your position. And now, she said, now I think maybe you actually meant it, she said. That's all, I just wanted to tell you that. She hugged me then, quick and a little awkward, the specific hug of a 9-year-old who spent 2 years learning not to trust hugs too easily, and went to go watch the movie with her brothers, leaving me standing in that kitchen more moved than I think I'd let myself be by anything that entire year. It's been almost 2 years since that night in the grocery store parking lot, with a dead battery and a grieving crayon. Rachel and I are engaged now, I proposed with all 3 kids there, because it never once occurred to me that it should be any other way, and Caleb, 5 now, spent most of the proposal asking if there'd be cake, which felt like exactly the right amount of chaos to accompany the moment. Emma is 11 now, still the most guarded of the 3, but she calls me by a nickname now, instead of my actual name, which she never explained the origin of, and which I've decided not to ask about, because some things are better left as evidence rather than explanation. Noah still asks my opinion on dinosaurs periodically, treating it as an ongoing screening process I apparently still haven't fully passed. Caleb has mostly forgotten the grieving crayon, and now considers me permanent jungle gym furniture, which I've made peace with. Rachel doesn't say the parking lot sentence anymore, at least not about herself. I asked her once, fairly recently, if she still believed it, that nobody wants a single mom of 3, and she thought about it for a long moment before answering. I don't think I believe the general version of that sentence anymore, she said. I think some people genuinely don't want this. And that's fine, that's honest, and I'd rather know that up front than find out later. But I don't think it's some universal law anymore. I think it's just a sentence a scared, exhausted, hurt version of me needed to believe for a while, because it was easier to expect the worst than to keep hoping and keep getting let down. You didn't just prove one exception to a rule, you kind of broke the rule for me entirely. I think about that sentence in the parking lot more than almost anything else from that year. Nobody wants a single mom of 3. I think about how casually she'd learned to say it, like a fact she'd stopped being surprised by. And I think about how the custody battle 6 months later was the actual test of whether, then I'll be the first, meant anything beyond a nice thing to say in a charged moment. I think too about the man who told her that sentence in the first place, a year before I ever met her. I don't know his name, I probably never will, but in a strange way, I owe him something, even though I'd never tell him that to his face. He handed her a belief she carried around like a fact for a year, adjusting her expectations downward to fit it, until the night she finally said it out loud to someone new, half expecting to hear it confirmed all over again. I think about how differently that night could have gone if I'd hesitated, or laughed it off, or given some non-committal answer instead of the one that came out of me without much thought at all. Some sentences get to decide the shape of the next several years of a person's life, and you don't always get to know in advance which ones those will be. Here's what I've come to believe. Anyone can say the right sentence in a parking lot at 11 at night, when the stakes are still hypothetical and the hardest part of the evening is already behind you. The sentence isn't the proof. The proof is what you do 6 months later, when a lawyer is trying to argue you're not really part of the family, and you have to decide, under actual pressure, whether you meant it or whether it was just a good line. I meant it. I still do. Every single day since, even on the ordinary days that don't come with a courtroom attached. The fevers, the homework, the crayons that break for no reason and somehow ruin an entire evening. Being the first person who didn't treat this as too much has turned out to be the best decision I've ever made, not despite the difficulty, but because of what showing up through it actually built. If there's one thing I've taken from all of this, it's that "I'll be the first" isn't a line you get to say once and coast on. It's a promise you have to keep making, out loud and in action, every time the situation gets hard enough to test whether you meant it. Rachel taught me that without ever saying it directly, she just kept watching, quietly, to see if the sentence held up under pressure, the same way Emma did, the same way anyone who's been let down before learns to watch. It held up. It's still holding up. And some promises I've learned are worth all the weight it takes to keep them. I think, sometimes, about all the small, ordinary Tuesdays that made up the 2 years between that parking lot and where we are now, the ones nobody would ever think to make a story out of. The nights I stayed to help with homework because Rachel had a late shift. The mornings I dropped Noah off at school so she could get an extra 20 minutes of sleep before her own workday started. The birthday parties, the parent-teacher conferences I sat through as a +1, nobody had officially designated a role for. The countless small negotiations of a blended, complicated, still-forming family, finding its shape one unremarkable day at a time. None of those days had the drama of a courtroom. All of them, stacked together, are the actual proof that a sentence said once in a parking lot can turn into something real if you keep choosing it, quietly, on every day that doesn't ask for a speech. Rachel asked me recently, half joking, whether I ever regretted how fast everything happened. The custody battle, the financial strain, the sheer scale of what I signed up for less than a year into knowing her. I told her the only thing I regretted was not stopping to help with that dead battery sooner, so we'd have had a few more months together before everything got hard. She laughed at that and told me that was, without question, the most romantic thing I'd ever said to her, which I found both true and slightly concerning given everything else I'd said over the past 2 years trying to earn that particular compliment. If this one got you, tell me in the comments, and if you want more real stories like this, subscribe. There's a new one waiting for you every week.